We drove by and the gentleman was slapping the girl.
He was slapping her?
He proceeded to hit her.
This is what I'm going to do. I've decided I am not going to cite you for domestic violence battery, okay?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, I want to introduce a new series I'll be doing over the next week, systematically analyzing the details and nuances of the almost 80-minute Moab incident. The best way to start this whole conversation is by breaking down the 911 call into its basic legally actionable parts. And this is what it is. The 911 call is to report a gentleman slapping and hitting a female. That's what precipitates the Moab incident on the late afternoon of August 12th. Then, almost an hour later, at 20 minutes to 6 or 5:40, that's about an hour after the 911 call, the officer tells Gabby,
I've decided I am not going to cite you for domestic violence.
He's decided not to cite Gabby for domestic violence for battery against Brian. That's the Moab incident in a nutshell, and possibly an analogy for GABBY PETITO's story overall, as well as Brian getting away with things perhaps prior to this, as well as perhaps getting away with murder, in a nutshell. So how exactly does it go from the cops called because Brian is hitting Gabby to Gabby being cited for hitting Brian? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Thank you to the 300 or 400 of you who have subscribed since the last video, and let's get started. So how did this inversion happen? How did it go from Brian hitting Gabby to Gabby hitting Brian? I think the simple answer is that she admitted what she did, and Brian didn't admit what he did. Gabby took ownership of her emotions, admitted them, showed her emotions transparently, while Brian wore a mask. Brian pretended things were a certain way when they weren't that way. Brian blamed her emotions and somehow came out of the whole thing appearing balanced. And you even have this fist pumping at the end, right? At 11 minutes to 6. From all the smiling, you can see there's plenty of duping delight going on here from Brian. But where was the Brian from the Merry Piglets? The Brian from the Spread Creek camp, a site that is currently a crime scene, or for that matter, the fugitive Brian? Possibly Gabby was afraid that if Brian was confronted, as he likely was at the Merry Piglets and at the Spread Creek camp, as well as in front of the grocery store, with the cops on scene, everything in terms of their project would possibly be over in a heartbeat. Gabby felt Brian was already losing interest, they were already fighting, there were already arguments, and might have used this as an out, might have taken this as the last straw, and she still needed him to finish their project. I think Gabby was also used to confronting Brian, but also used to making up with him. She knew, or she thought she knew how to handle the situation with him. How do we know this? Because they'd had plenty of arguments before, there'd been plenty of drama before, and Gabby probably knew the quickest, easiest, best way to diffuse the situation with Brian was to take the heat off Brian and put it on herself. According to People magazine, Alyssa Chen, 23 years old, said that her friend Gabby's on-again, off-again relationship with laundry had many ups and downs. And this is the quote I meant to mention in yesterday's live from People magazine. It goes like this, quote, "They had times they were toxic and times where everything seemed a lot more healthy," Chen tells People. "They had very low lows and very high highs. But they really seemed to love each other. When things were good, you'd be like, why can't I have a relationship like that? But when they were bad, you'd be like, oh my God, just break up and spare yourself from the drama and everyone else from having to hear about it." End quote. So this wasn't new territory for Gabby, and it wasn't new territory for Brian. But what I want to talk about in this episode is our ability to pay attention and read the details correctly. We might be going through this saying, How could the police do this? How could they make a mistake? How could they not see that? How could they misinterpret? We're not nearly as good at this as we think we are. I think probably a lot of you, when you saw the title image for this video, jumped to a conclusion. Did you check yourself to make sure? So, I mean, this is exactly how I came upon the idea for this video, because while I was, and I'm using this as an example, while I was doing research, I actually had the sound off in a particular newscast, from a particular newscast when this clip came up. And this is what I saw. I saw Gabby role-playing this action of hitting, right? And so I obviously thought the thing that I think most people would think. I thought Gabby was role-playing what Brian did to her. But when you go back and check, it's Gabby role-playing what she did to Brian. And the bottom line here is pay attention to what is happening. So in terms of the Moab incident, pay attention to what was reported. Pay attention to what was said. Pay attention to the facts that day. Pay attention to the people in front of you. Those details are important, and it's important that we check them. Over the next few days, I'll be going through the entire 77-minute, 38-second Moab incident, frame by frame, analyzing what she said and what he said. Similar to the Sermon on the Porch, the analysis I did on the Chris Watts case, and the Sermon on the Mount, the analysis I did in the Summer Wells case. This time we've got almost 80 minutes of footage. That's a mountain of footage. And we're going to refer to that as the Sermon at the Gate. Mostly the Sermon at the Gate deals with what Brian is saying, right? That is Brian's part of the Moab incident. And we really do have a treasure trove of these people speaking for themselves. We don't have to assume. We can look at what they are saying, what they are doing, what they are feeling, what is really happening. And just in cursory glance at this, I found lots of things that I'd assumed that weren't true. And so we're going to be uncovering a lot of new insight by going through this in almost like microscopic detail, systematically. By analyzing their interactions, we stand the best chance of finding out who they are, how they think, not how we think about them, and what really happened to Gabby Petito. You may think the role play of her fist hitting inside a vehicle is irrelevant, especially if it's her hitting. But don't make the same mistake the cops on scene did in the Moab incident. Hitting is very likely what did happen and why Gabby's funeral is tomorrow. She'd hit him in the past, she'd hit him before, perhaps she hit him again. The untold story is him hitting back. The untold story is the other Brian, the fugitive, the bizarre designer behind the mask of smiling apologies, the angry Brian. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I'm going to play out with 2 tweets from Gabby's father talking about the funeral, and I think that this really brings home the reality of what has actually happened to Gabby. We may intellectually know what we're talking about here, intellectually know that Gabby's no longer with us, but it takes a while for that emotional reality to catch up, and then it really is moving, it really is sad, it really is heartbreaking, isn't it? So I do want you guys to look out for the series that starts off on Monday after the funeral, where we're going to go through the Moab incident systematically, step by step, frame by frame, getting to know the real Gabby in her own words. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.